dive into the next section of our program, which I think is going to be a great discussion, billed as the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I promise that's not a description of our panelists. That's a description of the subject matter that we're going to cover here on Groundwater Recharge. And looking forward to having a conversation with the three of you, joined by Stuart Woolf, the Vice Chair of Western Growers. Next to Stuart's Daniel Mountjoy, the Director of Resource Stewardship for Sustainable Conservation. Last but not least, to my immediate left is Don Cameron, President of the California State Board of Food and Agriculture. And Don, I'm actually going to start the conversation with you because I think before we dive into some of the more nuanced positions and things that we have to discuss here, I think maybe we should set the table with the discussion of what is, the subject of groundwater recharge, what are we talking about, and what is the potential at play here when we're talking about groundwater recharge?
Well, so groundwater recharge is really a fairly simple operation. It's taking water when it's available, bringing it on farm, and allowing it to percolate down to the aquifer. There's a lot more to it than that. You have to have the conveyance, you have to have the infrastructure, but really, and you have to have the soils that are capable of bringing water from the surface down to your aquifer. Some areas are much better, some areas won't work. I mean, pretty simple, but you have to have access to the water when it typically during flood periods like we're seeing right now.
So that's the what. Let's continue our conversation with you, Daniel, as we talk about what is needed, if that's what we're talking about, what is needed for that potential of groundwater recharge to reach its maximum ability to store water in the ground here in California. What is the roadblocks in the way?
Yeah, I mean, Don's a great example of what is possible with an individual farmer working in a small group. To scale it, we're really going to need to gain the support of additional farmers who might be skeptical, rightly so initially, wondering why would I want to flood my crop, and risk my investment in that. And then you have to have irrigation districts and water suppliers and that can actually convey it and can operate their systems during the time of year when they're normally shut down in the winter, or very limited operations for flood management, perhaps, to make that water available. So it's a coordination between growers, irrigation districts, and then the water rights process at the state level.
So we've talked about what it is, we've talked about what is needed for it to reach its potential, and Stuart, that's where I'll bring you into the fold. In your mind, what is blocking the maximum potential of groundwater recharge right now?
Well, I think if we had greater certainty in the state, like when you did have flood flows, like under what conditions would you actually have the ability to get water? If we knew that under certain conditions and certain flows that there would be water available on our farm, we would go out and make greater investments to avail ourselves of those opportunities when they arose. The other thing I would add is we're recharging about the same amount as Don is. We're each going to do about 25,000 acre feet this year. But I think some of the cost associated, get lost in the equation. So like right now, for us to do 25,000 acre feet this year, we're going to spend about $3.5 or $4 million. We're buying water, bringing it in, opening up the spigots, and just letting it go into the ground. And not only are we buying the water, we're growing a great crop of weeds, and it's just a total mess out there. So then we've got to clean it up. There's a lot of money that goes into just putting the water in the ground. It seems like such a simple concept. And one thing I always think about is, when we have these flood events and what have you, it was great this year when the governor had an executive order allowing us to pull more of that water out of the system. But if there was a way where some of that water could be priced at a point that offset some of these costs, and there was assurance that you were going to get the water when it was available, I think you'd see a lot more growers on their lands putting in, reservoirs and what have you to actually store water or have plans in place. But we don't have those assurances, and we don't have any mechanism to encourage growers to bank.
So let's stick with that concept right now, because you say it'd be great to have the assurance that the water that is being stored is going to be available to you. For the uninitiated that might be listening to this conversation, can you walk us through why not? Why don't, if you do store that 25,000 acre feet, as you mentioned, why don't you have access to it?
Well, I don't think we have the policies in place. I don't think we have sufficient conveyance available to us. But, you know, I'm kind of a simpleton from Fresno. So I sit back and I think, well, we've got the Central Valley project, we got the state project. And during these crazy wet periods where, you know, we just heard Carla say, I think there was 175,000 CFS going under the Golden Gate Bridge. You know, it would be great to be able to utilize those assets and open them up and pump like crazy when we have those flood flows. But the thing that just drives me crazy, year after year of wet seasons, where you look at these numbers, what's flowing out to the ocean, and we're unable to get water. You know, we won't even know what our allocation is when a lot of these flows are happening. And so you sit back and you kind of wait. We just need to have, I think, better plans in place and a sense of urgency, which is tough for bureaucracies, right, to do this. But I can tell you right now, if you drive through Don's property, the minute there's water flowing near his property, he's moving water into his ponding basins and what have you, and over land. I'm always struck that Don's taking immediate action. I don't think the state is, or bureaucracies are set up for that.
Well, and Don, what was the setup that you needed to do on your operation to be able to take that immediate action that Stuart just mentioned?
So it really involved a lot of money. I mean, we were able to get a small grant from NRCS back in 2011 to kind of prove the concept that we could flood growing crops during the season. And then we followed that with a Department of Water Resources grant that we had a very substantial match to make the project complete. But, you know, it took 10 years. We worked with Kings River Conservation District to get this project actually built and functioning. But it ended up taking a lot more money than we anticipated. The timing, the agreements, the paperwork that we had to go through ate up a lot of the money. And we know that if we didn't have to do that, this project would have been built a lot sooner. We would have, you know, we missed a couple flood years in 17 and 19, but we were ready this year, and we fired up the project. But interesting, it just seems like there's a lot of pieces that could be made a little simpler.
Mm-hmm. You say you fired up the project. What did your capturing and storage look like this year during the flood events that we saw?
So this year we have about 350 acres of basins that have levees around them. They're the fields that we farm during dry years. As part of the grant, we're required to flood those. But really, we're doing the 350 acres of flooding those basins, plus another, we're up to a total of 2,500 acres that we're either using floodwater to irrigate with for in lieu recharge, which means we're turning off the groundwater pumps and using this water in place. And we're flooding pistachios, we're flooding wine grapes to the maximum that we can, to where we can get infiltration and move that water into the water table.
Daniel, let's talk about the infrastructure that we're looking at here, because obviously we hear Don's example of the things that he had to do on his operation to make this work. But as we zoom out from kind of the individual farm level, what else needs to happen to supercharge this recharging potential?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting contrast with the panelists here, both sort of in areas where there's not an existing infrastructure system in place for irrigation, summertime irrigation delivery. They're more groundwater dependent situations, but within the irrigation districts, the potential is really immediate. It's really a matter of turning on the system that's available during the summertime and moving it back out to the farm. So just a couple of examples, in Tulare Irrigation District, Madera Irrigation District, where they've been working on this concept now for about 7-8 years. In 2017, they started to test the waters with this idea, making water available at no cost to their growers. You know, a few growers took it. 2019, you know, it jumped up to a couple of hundred growers, and this year they're just running full scale, water is going out to farms as fast as they possibly can, initially with subsidized costs or reduced cost that the district was willing to put into it. And so they got 25,000 acre feet of water recharged in the first 4 weeks. I haven't gotten the latest numbers. We don't want to keep bothering them for the updates on it. We're going to wait till the end of the season. But that's the kind of scale of existing infrastructure that we can tap into where there's already irrigation districts. The challenge with those locations is they have summer irrigation water, so they haven't depleted the groundwater as much as the areas that are groundwater dependent. So the infrastructure question really is about, do you need to build new infrastructure out to the areas that are groundwater dependent, or can you recharge in the places where the systems are already in place and benefit the whole groundwater basin, and have instead go into a cooperative agreement where the folks that need that water are contributing to the district to do the recharge, helping subsidize those growers, incentivize them to take that water for the benefit of the basin. Sort of goes back to some of the earlier conversations about some of the GSAs in these basins, groundwater sustainability agencies. Are they coordinated together, or are everyone's doing their own thing on their own?
So what let's stay on that theme then, because I have to imagine a lot of this discussion is going to come back to a certain level of permitting and authority, and mineral rights will probably have to come into the conversation as well. And I promise this is not intended to be a loaded question, where do you think are the most areas for improvement when it comes to the more bureaucratic side of this conversation, and how do you think streamlining those processes could stand to benefit?
Yeah, I mean, the water rights piece is key. The executive order was a temporary initiative this year that allowed diversion of floodwaters to be recharged. It allowed that to happen. That program did not necessarily give an incentive to individual growers to do that. It was for the benefit of all of us that the water was pulled off the rivers and put in the groundwater. But that grower that took the risk on their land doesn't get a right to that water automatically to pump back out. So as the executive order goes through future revisions, becomes codified in legislation, which is in the process right now, there's a whole bunch of pieces that need to be built into that. The assurance piece that Stuart talked about is really about how much water can we take in flood years? What triggers that flood amount so that people can make those investments, and then have the rights to that water through their GSA to be able to know that that's something that can be pumped out again. There's a really big piece around how much water do we need leaving the rivers that needs to be answered for environmental flows. And it's something that, as a state, there's a system, a California Environmental Flows Framework, that has just not been implemented. With some investment, that could be determined for every river, what those flows are for fisheries needs and when, so that we would know that needs been met, now it's time to divert. So that's a big piece. And the other big piece is the water quality piece. There's a lot of concern by communities that all this recharge is going to flush historic agricultural chemicals and nutrients into the groundwater. Those folks need assurance that their water needs will be met, not just in quantity, but in quality. And so there's a number of pieces that we need to demonstrate, or give them assurance that an alternative water supply will be provided.
Stuart, having gone through some of this process, if you had the ear of the legislator, the regulator, the powers that be here, and could ask them to do a couple of things to help out your fellow producers that are looking at this process, looking at groundwater recharge, what's on your mind?
Well, there's got to be some fast track system or whatever, because when the waters are available, they're available, right? And I just think we got to do a better job collectively figuring out, we don't know when these storms are going to come. We do know it's great. We have a long history of wet and dry periods in California. So anything that would streamline our ability to get water on the land. I'll give you an example right now. We have part of the Central Valley project, the Pleasant Valley Canal is an offshoot of that. It goes through a piece of land we have where we have very sandy soil. It's well suited for recharging. And we needed a permit to pump out of that canal onto this land so we could get as much water on it as possible. We're waiting right now for, I think we have to have input from some tribal interest in case there were any Indian artifacts or something. And this is an area where there's no water, very dry. We've never had scrutiny like this before. And all we're trying to do is get a pipeline to go be buried underneath a road of ours. It's maybe 25 feet, and we estimate 2 to 3 months away from getting any kind of approval. That kind of thing, we've just got to be able to speed it up, because this is just lost opportunity that we could be sinking water. And so just have some type of fast track, kind of ready to go approvals would be really helpful.
Yeah, I'd love to see, watershed by watershed, trigger points set to where when we did hit a certain flow on the river or the stream, that we'd be able to automatically start taking. It'd be, like Stuart said, we like certainty. We'd love to be able to build projects, know that if certain triggers were met, that we'd be able to move that water on farm and distribute it and get it in the ground.
Mm-hmm. So what's stopping those trigger points from being set right now? What's the hurdle that you have to clear to make that happen?
I think there needs to be better measurement of the snowpack, of the streams, the flows, to where DWR could determine what these points, and the State Water Board, what these points are, and be able to issue permits to growers, to agencies along those flow, the streams, the rivers, to where we would have much better certainty in the future and not harm fisheries or other environmental issues along and other people's water rights for that matter.
So it's a supply issue as much as it is a demand issue, trying to figure that out.
Exactly.
Okay. So, Daniel, I want to bring you back into the fold here because, one of the things that you and I had the chance to discuss in advance of this conversation was looking not necessarily just at the individual farmer level, but as we zoom out at the infrastructure, looking at the rivers themselves and the conversation about whether or not the current geography of the river is going to be what it should be going forward. Can you walk us through where you think that conversation kind of blends into this one?
Yeah, I think the concept here is that the rivers are our conduits, at least on the east side of the Central Valley. They're the conduit from the snowpack to the point of diversion for recharge. And that system has worked pretty well under historic times, but with climate change, the anticipated events like this year, we've been fortunate so far. DWR has been, and the Corps have been able to manage the reservoirs in a way that the releases haven't jumped the banks and the levees of the rivers. But the anticipated flows in the future are as much as sixfold the releases that we see our peaks at right now. So we have to start thinking about how much can we divert off and how much bigger do we need to make the river corridor in order to avoid catastrophic flooding in communities and on farmland. And so part of the effort that DWR is doing around the watershed studies that Carla mentioned is we're working together to figure out what do these flows look like, how wide would we have to make the river channels, and then how much can you divert off? And start thinking of floodways, floodplains, easements for those floodwaters. Don's easements on his property are another way you can divert water off to relieve the pressure on the rivers. So all of those approaches need to be combined together as we think about the future of our water management. And recharge is a key piece of that. Some floodplains can do excellent recharge, others, the water doesn't really infiltrate. So knowing those spots where you want to expand the channel is really key.
But I mean, I have to imagine if we're going to talk about considering, redoing of entire river floodplains, I can only imagine some of the endangered species conversations that are going to need to come into play, some of the environmental permits that will come into play. That's not something that's going to be done quickly, working with some of these river systems, is it?
Actually, I mean, there's some great opportunities with that. One of the things that Sustainable Conservation has done over the past 10 years is establish expedited permitting process, programmatic permits for projects that have habitat enhancement value. So setting back levees, for instance, is a habitat enhancement benefit. And so there are programmatic strategies for doing that. That can be modeled and tiered off of to implement projects like that. One of the concept here is with Sigma, some land's going to have to be retired anyway. should it be just random scattered fields across the landscape, or could we concentrate through land retirement programs such as the multi-benefit land repurposing program from the Department of Conservation that actually can create the financial incentive for a grower to give up some of that land, perhaps farm it still in dry years, but give room for the rivers in wet years?
I had a question submitted that asked, would it be helpful to have any type of tax incentives to reward those who recharge, and if so, what could that potentially look like? Stuart, your thoughts?
Yeah, well, ultimately, I think if you were just able to supply some of this water that falls free from the sky and ends up in the rivers, if there was just some way, instead of a tax incentive, just give them some cheap water to put on the fields. I think that's all you need to do. Now, whether it comes along in some form of an incentive, that would be great. I just wanted to touch upon something. When the secretary was talking about we've recharged over 3 million acre feet this year, I actually thought the number would be larger than that. Just from the standpoint that annually, I think we pump about 2 million acre feet annually more than is going into the ground. So, in these wet years, most growers start kicking off their pumps and they just use surface water. And so that overdraft of 2 million acre feet, I think if the state did nothing, we should see a lot of that. Granted, there's some wide areas and what have you where people are still pumping, but then just the natural seepage and what have you, when you have wet years like this going into the ground, we should be at 3 million acre feet. I think the key is, in the wet periods, we got to get up and have a target of like 5 or 6 or whatever the number is, and be really focused on that target. I'm not convinced we have a target statewide as to how much we're trying to get in. If we did, and we were measuring it, I think we could manage it.
How would a statewide target work, given the different varieties of regions, snowpack flowing in different parts of the state the way it does, different soils hitting in different parts of the state? How would a goal, and what would management of that statewide goal look like in your mind?
Well, I think if there's going to be a plan, you have a target, number one. And so I think you get parties together and you get somebody like the work that's being done at Sustainable Conservation, where you're looking at various regions and figuring out how do we optimize the flood flows when they arrive, and what lands do we put them on and what crops. I think you do that statewide. I would love to see the state really step up and use some of these dollars that we have set aside to address these issues and be funding more work at like Sustainable Conservation. They're coming up with really great solutions on how to optimize flood flows and the lands that we have. I think you get stakeholders around the table, but this is one of the challenges with just bureaucracy, right? Then you end up with a whole collection of goals and objectives. We're really on just a farm level. I'm just telling my guys, look, we got to get 25,000 acre feet in the ground, and I'm tracking it every week, how much water we're getting in. And if they came back and said, well, this is our 3rd year of thinking about it and coming up with a plan, I'd get rid of all of them. That didn't happen at a state level, right? So I'm not suggesting we get rid of everybody. But the point is, you got to have a sense of urgency and execution.
Another question has been submitted that I want to ask you, Don, but before I do that, just would like to get your opinion on the tax incentive question that was mentioned. Do you think that's something that could potentially be worthwhile to get more folks involved and invested in this process?
I definitely believe some type of a tax investment program would be helpful. These projects are expensive, not only to growers like Stuart and myself, but to different agencies. But for individual growers, it makes a huge difference if there would be some type of incentive. We talked about the governor's executive order this year and it not giving the person that is developing this water the benefit to it. I also look at a tax incentive to help offset the additional expense of getting these projects put together, because it is tremendous. Stuart talked about the money he's spending. We're spending a lot of money just getting the water onto the land. We're working with DWR. They now have a program that will help fund the rental of pumps and diesel to bring that water onto your land for recharge, because really this is a public benefit. We're preventing flooding downstream by taking this water off the streams. But as far as the tax incentive, I know that there's already talk at the federal level for putting together some type of incentive, tax incentive for doing projects with recharge.
Can I just add that also the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service, Don talked about, they were involved in his 2011 project. Since then, the concept of this idea is developed and is now a practice that's cost shared by NRCS, so growers can receive a 50% cost share on-farm recharge or building a recharge basin on their land. It's still in a pilot phase. It's only in a couple of counties, but that's another way to incentivize this and spread this concept, tax benefit or straight cost share funding.
So, Don, the question I wanted to ask you was, and it was submitted, Warren Clark sent the question in, wondering how you all go about preventing leaching of nutrients into groundwater when you do the flooding to recharge. How does that work, and how does that ultimately impact the water that's being stored?
So part of the recharge program on our farm, we have partnered with Helen Dahlk out of UC Davis and DPR, Department of Pesticide Regulation. And we have, all of our wells have been baselined, so we know what the levels are in all of the wells anywhere near our recharge areas. Helen has also put sensors to measure and any movement in the fields that we're flooding. So we want to know, we don't want to create a problem. So we invited them on farm to do their research, and long term, we'll be able to see if we are actually moving nitrates, salts, any type of pesticides, herbicides into the water table. But really, part of this program is changing the way you farm. We're not going to go put fertilizer on fields that are going to have water applied to them. We're not going to be putting any herbicides, pesticides on those fields during or before these flood events. If we can, we typically know when we're going to get water. So we're very careful in the way we farm. It's really been a change in philosophy with the people on our farm, plus our PCAs that we work with.
Stuart, can you speak to that as well, as in terms of the change in approach to how you manage the land that is involved in this storage? How did that impact your operation?
No, I think Don touched on it already. It is a challenge, right? You want to. We're told repeatedly, like groundwater recharge is a much more efficient way to store water, and there's this, and yet at the same time, the last thing we want to do is create issues of groundwater contamination and what have you. Kind of back to your other question, what are the incentives that growers need? I can tell you just all of our acreage is under buried drip, and we've done a very good job of managing, as efficiently as we can, getting by with as little water as possible. The problem with doing that, though, and relying on groundwater as we've lost surface water supplies, we accumulate all of the salts just down the seed row. And so when there is water available, most growers have an incentive to go out and flush salts. I mean, they want to keep their land viable and what have you. So anyway, I just wanted to add that. There's every reason in the world growers would like to take water and get it on the land.
You had also mentioned earlier that your storage infrastructure thus far had captured 25,000 acre feet, and you said that was last year's figure. What was the time frame on that?
No. So this is a figure that we're trying to get in for the 2023 crop year. We've got a ways to go, but let me tell you some of the ways that we're doing it. Believe it or not, we thought this might be another dry year, so we had plenty of fields that we were fallowing or we just had cover crops on. So a lot of these fields, we've just turned on our drip systems and we've just been letting them go and surging them and getting a lot of water out there on lands where we've already cut the cover crops. So, It's not like we went out and set up and created huge berms. We're just getting water out every single day on these lands. So it's a combination of different things that we're doing.
Can you put the 25,000 acre feet figure into broader context in terms of what your usage is going to look like compared to the storage goal that you've set?
Well, when we were farming all of our property and we had plentiful water, we would use 50 to 60,000 acre feet. So in 1 year, right now we're using, during the drought, we've taken that back to, we're probably closer to like 30, 35,000 acre feet. And banking 25,000 is a big deal for us. And anyway.
Well, and Daniel, let's talk about that at kind of the state level too. I mean, if we look at these goals, if we look at the fact that the 3 million was stored, compare and contrast that, if you will, to what the state needs from an agricultural standpoint, from an urban use standpoint. What is the percentage of the pie chart that you think groundwater recharge could be playing here?
Right. The Public Policy Institute of California did a study, a couple of different publications, saying that the potential for recharge to offset our groundwater pumping is around 25 or 30%. So that's not on average. So unfortunately that's not solving our groundwater problem. It's an important piece of it. It's a key part that we need to work on. With DWR, we've been doing these studies of these watersheds, and the Merced watershed study came up with a very similar number that we could offset in that watershed 33% of their overdraft on average over time, sort of looking at wet years and dry years. If you add one other factor, which is reservoir operation, so you release reservoir water in anticipation of snowmelt slowly enough that farmers can take that water and recharge that water, not just what was available historically or today, but actually manage the reservoirs properly. That number from 33% goes up to about 45%. You add one more factor, which is infrastructure, better diversion capacity, conveyance within the district. This is just within one watershed. You can raise that to about 63% of the overdraft. So we can get to at least half the overdraft in a basin like the Merced, which is sort of midway between much wetter ones to the north and much drier ones to the south. So I think we can be more optimistic than just the 25% number that came out.
Very good. Would encourage you all to continue playing an active role in this discussion. I see we've got some more questions coming in. Please keep that up. And Don, I want to bring a question to you here that was submitted earlier. Somebody's wondering, with El Nino likely to bring water again this winter, what are you planning for this winter to take advantage of it should it in fact happen?
So yeah, we're hopeful that there will be continued water. We know the reservoirs are full, and they're, like I think Carla mentioned, you're going to have to draw down in the fall to be ready for another wet year. We've learned a lot about our project this year. We started out, it had been sitting for 2 years. We found that we had all kinds of gophers and little issues that, since we never had water in there, we actually lost a levee. We had to break and put about 4 feet of water on some pistachios, so we didn't flood the highway. It's been a challenging year, and my guys have stepped up to the challenge. But we're going to go back in, if we do get a dry period, rebuild some of the areas that we had issues with, and start building better infrastructure to move the water on the farm better. We've really learned a lot this year, and we want to be better prepared. I mean, this was our first run with it, and we've found some issues along the way that we want to correct, so we can be more efficient this coming year.
You say build some infrastructure. Can you expand on that in terms of what you think the needs are that would optimize your system?
Sure. We need to build some on-farm infrastructure, some smaller canals, put in additional pumps in key locations so that we can easily tie floodwater into our existing drip systems that we have on farm. We scrambled this year. My guys are about probably ready to kill me, but because I demanded that, and they rose to the occasion to get these portable pumps in place, hook them into the systems we have, and it was a real challenge. It'd be much better if we could have permanent systems put in place so that we can move water much more easily. We have a lot of legacy systems that we kept on farm that were flood systems. We'll be using those for transportation, moving some pipelines around for the future, so we'll be ready.
Stuart, what does your El Nino preparation look like?
Well, what we're doing right now, we're going to put in 10 different ponding basins. They're going to be located next to Westland's outlets, where we can just pump directly into those things. And we figured out the size of them and the infiltration rate that we can just kind of keep the spigot going at all times. We're going to go ahead and we're making these investments. Each one of those, there's 10 of them. I think each one is about $60,000, $70,000. So it's going to be $600,000 to $700,000. And we're doing it betting on the come that if, they start releasing waters, and just what Doctor over here was talking about, Daniel, that, hopefully we'll have access to these waters that we can just start plugging into those pits. But I think if the state, if they actually kind of telegraphed and told us that this was the intention, I think you'd see more growers moving more dirt to accommodate it and get it into the ground if it's available.
Well, then, if I may quickly here, I assume if more growers start moving more dirt, there's going to be more demand for pipes, for pumps, for all the assorted things that you need for one of these systems. Can you get what you need already, or are you already dealing with shortages as you look to expand?
I think you'd be able to find the equipment and the personnel to do it. I know a lot of those guys moving dirt have been a little busy down at the lake bottom, but eventually the levees are going to be high enough there to wherever, So we're able to get it done.
Yeah, we were able to, we had actually went out and rented pumps before we needed them. We were afraid there would be a shortage, and we paid for them to sit for about a month before we had water to move on farm. And yet, portable pumps became extremely difficult to find, especially in the large capacity. We looked at putting in some electric pumps, and we're told 4 to 6 months out before we could get anything on farm. So there are issues. Some of the pumps that we have one real large pump that took it, when we did put it in, took a year to actually order and get put in place. So they're not things you bring right off the shelf.
I was just going to add, from the perspective of the irrigation districts, one of the things we've found is they plan the winter season to be their maintenance season. So they've got the canals shut down. They're patching, where there's been erosion, they're fixing pipes, knowing that if we have clear indication that El Nino is coming, that's an indication for irrigation districts who are going to have to think about their maintenance plans, maybe shut down certain laterals, but have the rest available to be flowing full bore. And then the other piece that is standard pretty much on irrigation districts is their staff are year-long contract, but they are off during the winter. They work 12-hour days, 7 days a week during the summer, but they're not around during the winter. So staffing to actually deliver that water is another barrier that has to be anticipated. And if we know it's an El Nino year, this is the time to be making those plans, because there were a lot of districts that just simply couldn't do anything this winter because they just weren't ready.
And another question that was submitted with your particular name on it, so I'll direct it toward you, noting that we've been talking a lot about farmland in this conversation, but wondering, is there much, if anything, from an urban standpoint that can be done when it comes to groundwater recharge?
Interesting. We just met with the Urban Flood Association last week to talk to them about what's possible. The interesting thing that came up, most urban areas have flood basins in them already for catching water, but there's still additional runoff that they're dumping into rivers. They're interested in lands adjacent to the cities. This won't work in San Francisco, obviously, but our valley towns and rural towns, having farmlands around them that might be in their urban sphere of influence that might someday get paved over. But if it's really good recharge land, can they work with the landowner there to prepare those landowners and have contracts with them, much the way Don has a flood easement, that the cities could dump that water into those predefined locations. So moving it out of the city boundary, because there's just not enough open space in cities to capture all of that. I mean, their parklands, their recreational fields can capture some of that, but you then still have runoff off all that impervious surface.
So perhaps looking to stall some urban encroachment by way of converting some of that land to recharge potential. Very, very interesting. So another question that was submitted, recharge obviously being essential, but I'll ask this for whichever one of you would like to dive in and take it. Wondering what are the win-win solutions that mean less water usage overall, because as the questioner points, overdraft might not be reconciled by recharge alone. Is water usage part of this conversation when we're talking about water recharge as well?
Well, it's funny because, clearly if you're recharging, you're going to be flood irrigating, you're, doing all this kind of stuff. And at the same time, we're talking about, can't you be doing more with like drip and micro sprinklers and putting less on, I think when it's time to put water on the ground, you got to be in a position that you can really pour it in. I don't think the state of California and agriculture is going to save its way into prosperity. At some level, you just have to have sufficient water, reliable, what have you, to have a successful farming industry. So, I think those are these challenges that are kind of counter to one another. I just think we have to be prepared for the big gulp.
Yeah, we in 2008, 2009, we converted all of our row crops over to subsurface drip irrigation. And we saw huge water savings, and we saw improved crop yields, more uniformity. And so we cut back demand where we could. Our trees and vines already had drip and had for years. But when we made that conversion, we actually saw a lowering in the water use on the farm. And with groundwater recharge, we've done such a good job of pumping our aquifers dry. We have all kinds of room to store water. There is no question. But there's only two ways you can control your aquifer. One, add water, bring in flood water when it's available, and the other is to reduce demand. And that means fallowing, switching to different crops if you're not already using subsurface or drip irrigation of some kind. Those are your two choices. You're either going to idle farmland or you're going to find some water. And finding water in California is a very difficult task. And that's why the floodwater is key.
I think our challenge, especially those of us south of the Delta on the west side, our challenge is how do we optimize the fallowed lands, right? What are we going to do to generate income off those? And so I think, solar is clearly, this would, my father, if he saw the amount of solar on our property right now, he'd die again. It just breaks his heart because we have such productive, diverse, but I think we got to look at solar as like another crop. But in order to do that broadly, you have to have the distribution in place for people to actually tag into these systems and everything to avail themselves. I do hope that down the road with like CRISPR and everything, maybe we end up with varieties and plants, seed stock that actually we can get by using less water and grow productive crops. I think we got to be looking at some drought-tolerant crops like agave. I think it's a collection of these things, and using some of these fallow lands to prepare ourselves for the big gulp. And so it's a combination of things. I don't think ag in California is going away, but and the secretary mentioned this. I would love to see us reporting less on, both on our gross farm income, but what are we netting? Because I think it's what we're netting is what's really changing.
You mentioned the issue of fallowing, and someone actually just submitted a question on that, wondering, could fallowing a field for recharge and the value of that recharged water outweigh the lost value of a crop that didn't get planted? Is the economic potential there, do you think?
Well, when you're paying a couple $1,000s an acre foot in a drought to get a little extra water, you could convince yourself the payback is pretty quick, So, yes, it could, potentially.
We've gone through that scenario as well, and we know that, okay, we lose a crop on the years that we do have floodwater, that ground's non-productive, it's underwater. And the loss that we see, we talk about net income, we look at the net income, and we know by far it's much better to get the water in the ground. That's the long-term view. That's what we need to be doing if we want to continue to farm in the future.
Very good. So another thing, I want to follow up on something you said earlier, Don, talking about how I believe the comment was that we've done a pretty good job of draining our aquifers dry, and there's a lot of room for storage potential. Do we know what that is? I mean, do we know, like, if in a perfectly optimized system you could get all the acre feet down there that you could, how long are you pumping down there before your aquifer is full again?
Well, each aquifer is different, each region is different, but we know in our GSA, our Groundwater Sustainability Agency, we could store 2 million acre feet in 120,000 acres. So we know the potential's huge, but you've got to be able to have the ability to move it to the location you need to get it in the ground. And if you can't do that, that water's lost. I look back at the 50s and 60s and what California did as far as reservoir building, infrastructure, canals, and I think we need another push like that for groundwater recharge and to store water underground. I think, the majority of the rivers have dams. I think above ground storage is fantastic for a lot of reasons, but we have a huge potential. We've created plenty of room in our aquifers for water storage, and I think the state should really move forward with a in-depth program of putting something like this together with the emphasis they did back in the 50s and 60s.
Well, let's talk about that, Daniel. I mean, if there's going to be that kind of, mammoth movement, mammoth investment in that kind of infrastructure, is that something that, has the political feasibility to get done, do you think? Do you think there's the interest and the ability of folks, that work a few blocks away from here to help move in that direction?
I think we heard a little earlier some of the conversations around surface water storage and the challenges of that. I think this has a much greater possibility of getting political support for it. I think we do still need to set some of these basic social public benefits. The flow in the rivers for environmental needs needs to be clearly determined. And then, as we were hearing, in the Delta, Carla Nemeth was talking about the ability to pump those extra flows. When all the environmental needs are met, being able to pump that down the west side of the valley, we need places for that water to be stored. And I think that's where the storage opportunities, there's only 1 or 2 cross valley ties at this point, and having more of that to get it onto that really prime recharge land where the space exists. I mean, there's 3 times the amount of space underground right now of all of our surface water reservoirs combined that's empty. It's just empty reservoirs underground that we need to figure out how to get the water to those places. We could triple our storage capacity with some fairly limited infrastructure investment. The environmental community, as an environmental organization, representing that community, in order to make that pass, we have to demonstrate that we're protecting the environmental needs as well, and those two have to go hand in hand. That'll move the process forward.
Stuart, I want to ask you a question that's been submitted here, wondering how federal crop insurance or risk management programs might need to change to better enable recharge.
Boy, that's a doozy. I don't know. I've even thought about that, how they would have to change. I really don't have an answer for you.
We know that when we're flooded unintentionally, that there is crop insurance that covers that. But intentionally going out and flooding ground for groundwater recharge, I think the RMA might have a tough time with that. I don't suspect that they would like to cover that situation. But there needs to be some type of compensation or benefit to whoever is putting water on their ground. I mean, it doesn't just benefit an individual grower, it benefits the entire region It benefits the rural communities, the disadvantaged communities. Their water supply is increased. Anytime you can move water underground, everybody benefits.
And that's another argument for why doing recharge not on cropland, active cropland, but on fallow fields, you avoid that risk, and you get the added benefit. You're not farming that land also in terms of water savings, pumping savings, and it's a recharge location. But in the big years, we need more land than people are actually fallowing to stay economically viable. So it's going to need to be both, and I think insurance will be an important piece. Helen Dahlke at UC Davis is working right now on a tool to be able to estimate safety for the crop health in terms of oxygen levels in the soils. And we've been doing a similar effort with DWR. I think if you could create a program that says this is the safe level, and yes, if there's crop damage that happens when that occurs, you're giving some assurance to the risk folks that we're not just randomly throwing water on fields, but we're following a standard.
Well, another question was asked if you could ask university researchers to prioritize research, what are you looking to learn? Is it more about how to best improve recharge, or is it maybe additional questions about crops that could be grown after that recharge and the flooding takes place? Stuart, I mean, anything kind of burning questions in your mind as you still work to better understand the practice and how to use it in your land management?
Yeah, we're still trying to figure this out. I was asking Don last night over dinner, like, how long are you going to flood those pistachios? I mean, you're going to wait till the leaves are starting to fall and turn, because some of this we really don't know exactly the impact that, having wet feed on some of these crops and how long, we're kind of playing it along as we go. The other thing, when you take a piece of ground, you just saturate it. What have you just done to, after spending years of regenerative ag practices and building healthy soils, did we just kill every microorganism and what have you that we've invested in, like building these soils? I'd love to learn more about that.
Don, how long are you going to flood those pistachios?
Well, we did it first this year. We actually killed some pistachios. Let's say the field we put about 3.5, 4 feet of water on. We had one little area that we couldn't get the last bit of water off, and we probably killed 50 trees in the process. And it went anaerobic. We actually had a cover crop in there, and it was a little different than the normal. But you're right, sir. We have a lot of trees that have had water on them for a long time this year. But we need more research in this because, we don't know if we're damaging roots. We've been told you can't do that. You'll be killing roots by putting water on for that long. I've got a field that's full of nutgrass, and I'm hoping that this nutgrass is going to be dead after 5 or 6 months of flooding. But I have my doubts. I think it's going to survive. But there's a lot of details that really nobody's worked on, and the research needs to be done. I mean, we took a risk early on. We flooded wine grapes until it got hot, and then we started seeing symptoms. The vines turned bright yellow. This is back in 2011. It's like, okay, time to shut the water off. And we shut the water off because we didn't want to kill the vines. And like 10 days later, 14 days later, they're back to a dark green, looked great. We know we have sandier soils and they drain well, but a lot of other areas don't, and I think there's a real need for research in this so that people have a better idea of what to look out for, so we don't end up killing crops. We did find that the infiltration rate in our pistachios was phenomenal, much better than our open fields. So I don't know if it's the roots that provide the channels, but we're learning a lot this year too.
So you mentioned some of the things that you've learned. I mean, any experiments you're kind of thinking through on your end as you try and figure out how this is going to work on your operation?
Yeah, we're trying to give the ground a rest in between to where we have trees. Get it wet, put a lot of water on, let it dry back out again before we hit it again. We're working with Scott Bradford out of UC Davis as well. We have 5 dry wells so that we're actually not going through the surface. We're dropping the water down a lot closer to the aquifer to where you can get recharge a little quicker. and you don't run the risk of moving any salts, nitrates through the above surface portion that you're farming. So we're looking at a lot of different things on farm and trying different ways to improve water infiltration. We've tried several different things there too. So it's challenging, to say the least.
Yeah, Daniel, your thoughts on potential research gaps that that could use a little attention?
These guys have definitely hit on many of them. Cover crops, I think, is a really interesting emerging topic right now. Cover crops take water to grow, and that's kind of being disincentivized by caps on groundwater pumping. At the same time, sites where cover crops have been in place during recharge events, where they're pulse applying water, we're seeing much faster infiltration rates through those systems. So they might take a little water in the fall to get them started up, but then you can pour more water on if you've got the right soils using cover crops. That's anecdotal at this point, so some more research demonstrating that is one area. The whole thing around the nutrient management, and one really big sort of question mark that we have around recharge is not the current nutrient management. Don and Stuart talk about reducing that prior to recharge, but what's sitting there in the zone between the surface and the groundwater from 50, 60, 100 years of farming that may not have been flushed out, and you put a bunch of water on the top. Are we going to create these sudden plumes of pollutants that could affect drinking water? So Thomas Harder and others at UC Davis have looked at ways to think about historic cropping patterns to try and get an estimate of what's sitting under there and what kind of irrigation practices were there for the last 50 years that may have already flushed it, or maybe it was really super efficient drip, and there's just a bunch of nutrients sitting there waiting to go. So knowing that variable in the equation is going to be key to predicting what kind of impact we're going to have, and I think there's a lot of interest in understanding that.
We're just about out of time here, so I'm going to wrap up with this question in 30 seconds from each of you on if the four of us sit down on this very stage in 5 years, where do you hope the conversation is on groundwater recharge? What do you hope is the successes that we're discussing in 5 years on this very stage? Stuart, I'll start with you and work our way back down.
Well, I hope that we're all excited about, that we're recharging more water when it's available. We have markets in place where we're able to kind of trade this and, have a functioning water market, and we have the infrastructure in place that actually allows us to avail ourselves of the water we're putting in the ground. I suspect we'll be probably having the same conversation we're having right now 10 years from now. I mean, I hate to be a cynic or a skeptic, but we've been talking about water for my entire life, and I suspect we'll be doing the same down the road.
Daniel, where do you see the debate in 5 years?
I think industry groups like this will all be part of engaged in this. The Almond Board has been super involved in this for a number of years now. I think all the industry groups could be looking at their unique crop suitability, sponsoring the research that's needed to support their growers to supply themselves with their water supply. I think that in itself will be the incentive to gain a lot more participation. And then I think the water rights permitting side of things will, I am actually hopeful that there will be a process in place to clarify that water availability.
And Daniel, on those words, I hope we're not talking about permitting in 5 and 10 years. Hopefully we have that solved. We have a process in place to where we know when we can take water, when we can't take water. We know that our climate is getting more extreme. The past 10 years, we've had 3 years of floods, 7 years of drought, and we need to be prepared. We need to be able to have infrastructure in place. Hopefully, we're talking about additional funding to be able to put these type of operations together and save water and be more resilient here in California.
Very good. Well, no pun intended, a flood of information here over the course of the last hour. I know I learned a lot. I hope all of you did as well. Please join me in thanking our panelists.